The Second World War was by far the most deadly and destructive conflict to ever occur, and its impact is still felt to this day. But what exactly caused the outbreak of hostilities in 1939? What caused the Second World War? Just like with many great events in history, its origins can be traced back through decades. As with the Second, the First World War also had a lasting impact, completely destroying the world order as it was prior to 1914. The aftermath of the Great War was just as important as the horrendous battles waged during it. Whether it was to truly be the war to end all wars would depend on the ability of the victorious powers to create a lasting peace. The President of the USA, Woodrow Wilson, a fairly controversial man, presented what he called his 14 points to the US Congress for the first time in early 1918. The 14 points not only demanded that Germany return all of its seized territory, but aimed at laying down the groundwork for a new post-war order. New states were to be made out of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. These new states, such as Poland, would obtain what they needed to assure an opportunity on autonomous development. But most importantly, it dictated certain requirements such as free trade, freedom of navigation, and disarmament to create a safer world for democracy. For all his flaws, this was arguably a very decent proposal for creating a post-war world. To put his vision into practice, the League of Nations was created in 1920 to further cooperation between states and enforce the treaties of the post-war world. One of these such treaties, and the most important of them, was the one signed between Germany and the Western Allies. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on the 28th of June, 1919, between the victorious powers and a new democratic government in Germany. The conditions of the Paris Peace Conference were made clear. Germany was to be disarmed and forced to pay reparations, specifically to France and Belgium, for the damages it inflicted upon them. Since no Allied troops had set foot on German soil, the Germans wrongfully believed that the conditions would be far softer. The reaction of the German public was that of horror and indignation, especially amongst the German far right. Even the working class, mostly loyal to the Social Democrats, were appalled by the treaty. Many have argued that the conditions were unfair and only served to punish Germany. While harsh, to say that they were completely unjustified is a stretch of the imagination. Germany aimed to annex large extensions of Eastern and Western Europe, something that was partially realized after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, along with its complete hegemony on the European continent. Not only that, but the German occupation of Belgium and France was particularly brutal. The occupied territories were extensively exploited for all they had, and any resistance, fictitious or real, was often punished by death. During the retreat, the Germans resorted to a scorched earth policy, destroying anything they couldn't take, notably by flooding French coal mines. The Allies, especially France and Belgium, had all the right to demand reparations and to neutralize Germany from ever becoming a threat again. Despite all that, the Allies still took into consideration Germany's ability to pay before any price had been set. While you can argue that it was hypocritical to punish Germany for the same crimes that the Allies committed elsewhere, the question isn't whether or not the Treaty of Versailles was unjustified, but whether or not it was the best option. Arguably, there was a chance for ordinary Germans to reconcile with their former enemies despite the harsh conditions. But reconciliation wasn't given the same priority by the Allies as was the payment of reparations. This was best demonstrated with the Franco-Belgian occupation of the Ruhr Valley. While it was understandable that the French and the Belgians wanted to assure Germany's payments, it was arguably a poor decision. The international community, including Britain, was opposed to the occupation and significantly increased tensions between them and the Germans. But most importantly, it caused severe economic hardship for Germany by denying them the region's coal deposits and putting thousands of workers out of a job. In a desperate attempt to pay off their debt, the Germans began printing money at an even faster rate than previously seen, resulting in the infamous hyperinflation of the Weimar era. The occupation of the Ruhr Valley was a short-term solution for a long-term problem. What was arguably the most effective way to neutralize Germany as a threat would have been the establishment of a stable German democracy. But to do this, the Weimar Republic would need a period of stability to consolidate its authority and to prove to the public that democracy was a viable option of government. But from the very beginning, it was threatened by the global economic crisis and from sabotage from the far left and especially the far right. But the Treaty of Versailles only worsened the public's faith in the Republic, and conspiracy theories such as the stab-in-the-back myth began getting more traction. Combine all this with the fact that a sizable portion of the population, those being conservatives, monarchists, and nationalists, were hostile to the Republic from the very start. The simple fact that Germany had lost the Great War and that the Kaiser was overthrown by a center-left revolution was enough for them to hold a grudge against the Republic founded by what they called the November Criminals. But that didn't mean that they couldn't have been convinced of its benefits. Gustav Stresemann was arguably one of Weimar's best statesmen, being credited with ending hyperinflation and being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for having signed an agreement of reconciliation with France. Despite his efforts to strengthen the Republic, Stresemann was by no means a Democrat. He was initially hostile to the Weimar Republic, sought to revoke the Treaty of Versailles, and had a wait-and-see policy when the Republic was threatened by a coup. In his heart, he was still a proud monarchist, but despite all that, he believed that an authoritarian government would jeopardize Germany's foreign relations and risk the nation's stability. A democratic government, on the other hand, in his mind, was essential to guaranteeing Germany's survival. While he may have been convinced, the public was much more hesitant. The struggle of the 1920s only hurt the image of the Republic. Even during the so-called Golden Age between 1923 and 1929, the Weimar Republic was still ravaged by violence and political turmoil. The pro-democracy parties, those being the SPD and the Centre Party, slowly lost favor to the public and would never again receive the same support that they had enjoyed in 1919. After only a year, the Weimar Republic had become a democracy without Democrats. Over the course of a decade, the German public started voting for more authoritarian parties. First, they elected the conservative former general Paul von Hindenburg as president in 1925. Then, the German People's Party, the one Strussmann had founded, began to splinter and many of its members went to the extreme right. The SPD also began losing voters to the communist KPD, but when people got tired of these groups, they sought even more extreme alternatives. After the Great Depression, the National Socialists, led by Adolf Hitler, asserted themselves as a serious player in German politics. Arguably, the main reason why people voted for the Nazis didn't have to do with their proposals for Germany's future, but simply because people were just fed up. To quote the historian Richard Evans on why people voted for them, "The Nazi Party was a party of protest, without a positive program and with few practical solutions for Germany's problems. But its extremist ideology, adaptive and sometimes veiled depending on the circumstances and the nature of the specific group of people towards whom the message was directed, made use of a sufficient number of pre-existing popular German beliefs and prejudices to give the impression to many that they were worth supporting. For these people, desperate times called for desperate measures." The Weimar Republic failed largely due to the circumstances it found itself in. Germany, along with many other democracies, fell victim to the instability of the post-war era. German democracy was never given a chance to prosper. With their fall came a myriad of extremist groups that would drag the world into another brutal war. When the opposition failed to defeat them on the home front, it was left to international forces to put a stop, or, at the very least, contain them. The League of Nations was basically created for this exact purpose. While it attempted to fulfill the role of an international peacekeeper, they were unable to do so due to the lack of a strong military force. One of the consequences of the Great War was that it weakened the world's previous dominant powers. Britain, with its large navy, had essentially taken on the role of an international police force prior to the Great War, but after its conclusion, she was simply too weak to continue this role. Economic hardship forced Britain to significantly cut back on military spending and put an end to her hegemony on world power. The French had it a lot worse than the British, which is why they were adamant on acquiring reparations from Germany. The only major allied power who didn't suffer from severe economic hardship after the war was the United States of America. In stark contrast to Europe, the US was experiencing a golden age referred to as the Roaring Twenties. The signing of the Washington Naval Conference made it clear that the US was to be given an important role in the New World Order. She was on par with Britain in terms of naval tonnage permitted and was to commit to the enforcement of the current status quo. However, the US was very hesitant to get involved in international affairs. In fact, she didn't even join the League of Nations, nor did she sign the Treaty of Versailles, opting for a separate piece of Germany instead. On the surface, it may seem odd that the US would withdraw itself from international affairs after all that had happened. The Great War had demonstrated that conflict on the other side of the globe could affect the United States in one way or another. But after a deeper examination, it starts to make more sense. Peace could only be assured via security guarantees from both Britain and the US. Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations stated that members of the League had the obligation to protect and preserve fellow member states in the event of aggression. The US government feared that Article 10 would drag them into unnecessary conflict and violate their national sovereignty. The role of the United States in the world still hadn't been properly defined, and tying her to various obligations only made things more confusing. Combine that with civil unrest in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, their priorities were simply elsewhere. In this critical moment, the world was without an effective police force that could maintain the peace. This was arguably one of the most influential factors in the outbreak of the Second World War. I'd recommend reading the book, War, What Is It Good For? By Ian Morris if you want to learn more on why a global police force of some kind is necessary for global stability. The reason why the Treaty of Versailles failed to guarantee a lasting peace is simply because no one wanted to, or was incapable of enforcing it. The inability to enforce treaties and international law didn't just allow Hitler to rearm Germany for another war, but also enabled Italy and Japan to pursue their own imperial ambitions. Italy had joined the side of the Allies in the Great War after being promised by the Treaty of London that she would obtain a modest amount of new territories with the chance of even partitioning the Ottoman Empire. But after the war, Italy was arguably betrayed and only received some of what she was promised. The consensus among Italians was that the Treaty of Versailles was a national humiliation. Combine all that with the fact that Italy suffered horribly as a result of the Great War. Over 600,000 Italians were killed, the economy was in ruins, and thousands of war veterans were left unemployed. The already fragile Italian democracy was unable to cope with the crisis, further radicalizing the population. The fascists led by Benito Mussolini were more than willing to take advantage of the situation, claiming to be the defenders of a strong, renovated, and united Italy. After he and his black shirts strong-armed the king into appointing him as prime minister, Mussolini started laying down the foundation for his new Roman Empire. Once the Italian parliament had given Mussolini emergency dictatorial powers, there was nothing stopping the fascist steamroller. Mussolini basically did what Hitler intended to do with his beer hall putsch. He successfully usurped a struggling democracy by intimidation and violence. Once in charge, he could begin to pursue Italy's imperial aspirations in Africa and in the Balkans. When Mussolini invaded Abyssinia in 1935, there was close to nothing done to stop him. The most the League of Nations did was impose an embargo on weapons, ammunition, and boycotted Italian goods. But an oil embargo was refused in fear of provoking Italy into attacking other member states, and without the compliance of the US, who produced 2/3 of the world's oil supply, it would have been pointless. As for Britain and France, their resolve was just as lacking. While the British intimidated the Italians by sending a fleet of warships into the Mediterranean, they made it clear to the Italians that they were unwilling and incapable of going to war. The French, on the other hand, weren't just unwilling to go to war, but had essentially approved Italy's invasion of Abyssinia. The French Foreign Minister, Pierre Laval, who would become infamous for his collaboration with the Nazis, even signed a deal with the Italians with a secret clause that basically allowed Mussolini to do what he wanted with Abyssinia. After the occupation of his country by Italian forces, Emperor Haile Selassie gave a speech to the League of Nations denouncing Italy's actions and their failure to stop them. I, Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia, am here today to claim that justice is due to my people, and the assistance promised to it 8 months ago when 50 nations asserted that aggression had been committed in violation of international treaties. Unhappily for Ethiopia, this was the time when a certain government considered that the European situation made it imperative, at all costs, to obtain the friendship of Italy. The price paid was the abandonment of Ethiopian independence to the greed of the Italian government. The Italian government asserts that for 14 years it has been preparing for its present conquest. In October 1935, the 52 nations who are listening to me today gave me an assurance that the aggressor would not triumph, that the resources of the covenant would be employed in order to ensure the reign of right and the failure of violence. Placed by the aggressor face to face with the accomplished fact, our state's going to set up the terrible precedent of bowing before force. Imperial Japan suffered from many of the same issues as Germany and Italy. Over the course of the interwar period, the army and the navy usurped the authority of the parliament and even that of the emperor. Going back to the Washington Naval Treaty, the US and the British essentially relegated Japan to the position of a secondary power by limiting her navy, much to the frustration of the military. The rise of Japanese militarism was also accompanied by an increased demand for resources to sustain Japan's growing population and industry. Japan had begun building an overseas empire during the late 19th century, and after establishing a sphere of influence in China and annexing Korea, they sent thousands of troops to Siberia during the Russian Civil War. Japanese intervention was motivated by the need to acquire resources, as well as their dreams of building a formidable empire in Asia. Intervention in Siberia was, however, a complete failure. But Japan wouldn't give up on our aims in Siberia, and for the meantime, would focus on China. On the 18th of September, 1931, rogue Japanese soldiers staged a false flag attack on a train close to the Korean border known as the Mukden Incident as a pretext for the occupation of Manchuria. The government in Tokyo was completely against any war with China, but found itself powerless to stop the army. Japanese aggression against China was treated the same way as it would be with Italy a few years later. In fact, some governments viewed it as a better alternative to Manchuria falling under Soviet control. Even after Japan began its full-scale invasion of China and committed some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century, the response of the international community was incredibly lacking. Despite feeling sympathy for the Chinese, the US did little to help them, even allowing Japan to purchase oil from them well into 1941. The general lack of support was due in part to the fear of Japanese retaliation, the unpreparedness of the US military for war, and the American public desiring non-intervention. The simple fact is that these two states would never have gotten to where they were at the outbreak of hostilities in 1939 had it not been for the mercy of superior powers. Italy was, during the war, to put it lightly, a pathetic display of poor planning. While Japan was much more capable, they still lacked the industrial capabilities of the West, and the Pacific theater was relegated to a sideshow, hence the Europe First policy of the Allies. The only reason they weren't stopped was not just because the priorities of the Allies lied elsewhere, but also due to a series of strategic miscalculations. The appeasement of Nazi Germany was one of those miscalculations. Many have rationalized appeasement as a necessity to give the Allies the time to rearm themselves for a future war with Germany. However, by doing so, they also gave the Nazis the chance to do the same and at a much faster rate. Arguably, the Allies would have been better off putting their foot down the moment German troops re-entered the Rhineland when Germany was at its weakest. The German troops who marched into the Rhineland had orders from Hitler himself to turn back and not to resist if the French were to oppose them. Only 3,000 German troops entered the demilitarized zone, with 30,000 in reserve. But the French were fearful of another war, while the British were indifferent, even voting against the application of sanctions by the League of Nations against Germany. Once the regimes of Mussolini and Hitler had consolidated power, they began pursuing increasingly more aggressive foreign policies. One such example was the Spanish Civil War, where Germany and Italy supported the nationalists led by Francisco Franco. Their support was arguably one of the determining factors in securing Franco's victory. The Spanish Republic was essentially abandoned to be destroyed. Britain and France either remained neutral or only gave minimal support to the Republicans for a short period of time, leaving it up to the Soviets to do the heavy lifting. One of the reasons for the lack of support for the Republic was the strong anti-communist sentiment in the British government at the time. Ironically, their decision to not support them brought the Republic closer to the Soviets. While their fear of communism wasn't entirely unfounded, both the British and the Republicans shared many of the same democratic principles that could have united them in their fight against fascism. Since the end of the Great War, democracies all over the world were in decline. The Spanish Civil War presented an opportunity to stop this trend and secure a potential ally in the fight against a greater enemy. Appeasement was primarily the result of the decline of both Britain and France, as well as the lingering trauma from the Great War. No one wanted conflict and preferred to stay out of it. While the advantage of hindsight has allowed us to better determine what actions the Allies should have taken, there were still signs that appeasement wasn't a viable option to secure peace with Germany. Germany, Italy, and Japan all made it clear that they were in contempt for this post-war status quo, and sought to expand their respective empires. Hitler used the supposed wrongdoings of the Treaty of Versailles to mask his true intentions, but to an extent he still revealed his plans for expansion in Mein Kampf, though it appears that only the Poles and the Soviets took it seriously for obvious reasons. Under the gaze of justice, Hitler was able to rearm Germany, reoccupy the Rhineland, and even annex Austria without much of a hitch. Even after carving up Czechoslovakia, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain triumphantly returned to Britain waving around a single piece of paper with Hitler's promise not to misbehave. The entire strategy of appeasement relied on the belief that Hitler could be trusted, that he could be appeased. But whatever trust they may have had disappeared the moment Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. The fact is, a militaristic dictator with grandiose dreams of conquest, such as Hitler, can never be trusted to keep their word. Give them 1 inch and they'll take a whole kilometer. When Germany threatened to invade Poland, the Allies had finally learnt their lesson. But it wasn't their actions that led Hitler to believe that the conquest of Poland would succeed, but the confidence given to him by an unlikely candidate, the Soviet Union. On the surface, the Nazi-Soviet pact seems like a self-interested and evil thing that Stalin did. While that isn't false, it goes much deeper than just pure malice. So, Mr. Putin, why did the USSR sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? Well, to understand why the USSR signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, we have to go back to the year 1236, when the Kieven Rus was invaded by the Mongols. Ever since then, the states that emerged after its collapse, such as Muscovy, developed a deep fear of being invaded. To protect the Russian heartland, the Russians pursued a strategy of defensive territorial expansion in an effort to create a buffer between them and any potential invaders. This is why Russia conquered places such as Siberia. A trend in Russian history that started after the Bolshevik Revolution is Russia's distrust of foreign powers. This paranoia was a result of their new ideological differences as well as foreign intervention in the Russian Civil War. After the Civil War, the USSR was left economically devastated and vulnerable. New states have been created in former Russian border territories such as Poland, the Baltics, and Finland, bringing any potential enemy closer to the USSR's core regions. Reconciliation between the Soviets and the Western powers, i.e. Britain and France, was never going to happen over their fear of communism. The brutality of the Bolsheviks also did little to convince them otherwise. Their distrust of the Soviets was best represented 2 weeks before the outbreak of hostilities in 1939, when the British and the French rejected a Soviet offer to form an anti-Nazi alliance over fears for Poland, the effectiveness of the Red Army, and just how committed Stalin was to such a pact. By the time they reconsidered the Soviets' offer, Stalin had already changed his mind. The USSR was left incredibly vulnerable during the interwar period. Even after close to a decade after the Civil War, Stalin claimed in a speech for his 5-year plan that the USSR was 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. From a Soviet perspective, they were surrounded by enemies from all sides. Stalin even believed that if Poland didn't ally herself with the USSR, then she would be forced to do so with Germany and invade the Soviet Union. Considering the example that appeasement gave, it's not unreasonable for the Soviets to assume this. In a world of uncertainty and on the brink of war, Stalin was given one final offer by the Nazis: to sign a non-aggression pact and to partition Europe into spheres of influence. Stalin knew this alliance between the USSR and Nazi Germany was never going to last. He had read Mein Kampf and was well aware of Hitler's plans for Eastern Europe. However, he didn't immediately see Hitler as a threat. From a Soviet point of view, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact allowed them to prepare for war at the expense of the Germans and the Western Allies. Turning Germany towards the West gave the USSR an opportunity to secure its borders. The invasion of Poland and of other states wasn't just viewed as the reconquest of former Russian land, or even as a crime, but as the elimination of potential threats. However, aside from the morality of such a pact, it also came with the consequence of strengthening Nazi Germany as well. The Pact of the Soviets allowed Hitler to secure his eastern border and focus all his efforts to the west, not to mention the vast amount of resources, such as oil, that the Germans received from the Soviets to fuel their war machine. Stalin mistakenly believed that the Germans and Allies would exhaust themselves after fighting each other. But the Nazi conquest of Western Europe put this belief to an end. All of this was possible thanks to the collaboration of the Soviets. Just like appeasement, except on a more insidious level, it was a strategic failure by Soviet leadership not to prevent war, but to save themselves from a German invasion. The Second World War was ultimately caused by the instability that came after the First. It delegitimized democracies all around the world, notably in Germany, Japan, and Italy, creating the conditions for extremist groups with dreams of expansion to seize power. It also weakened the world's previous powers, those being Britain and France, to the extent that they couldn't enforce international law, while the trauma of the Great War made them wary of any further bloodshed, even if it was to prevent a greater tragedy. The only power that was capable of enforcing international law, the United States, was itself uncertain about her role in the New World Order, and preferred to not entangle herself in international obligations. The uncertainty of the interwar period made countries like the USSR prone to desperate decisions to save themselves just for a little bit longer. The peace established after the Great War could have only been maintained via strict enforcement, but the power to do so simply didn't exist. Whether it was Britain, France, the USA, or the Soviet Union, they all made a series of strategic errors that enabled the Axis powers to grow much stronger than them, not to mention the dubious morality of it all. They believed that they could trust them not to conquer more than what they'd been given, and that they respect the treaties that they had signed. The lack of reconciliation with the Germans and the grudges held by both Italy and Japan against the Western Allies served as a justification to mobilize their citizens for war. Whether or not the Second World War could have been prevented without the advantage of hindsight is hard to determine, but the signs are still there. Regardless, it would have taken a miracle to prevent another conflict. On the bright side, we've learned some lessons from the interwar period that we can hopefully use to make the world a safer place. Peace is not something that comes free. It's something that at times needs to be defended by force. Putting a foot down in the face of aggression is perhaps the best way of preventing a conflict, even if some blood has to be shed. Cooperation in policing the globe and enforcing international law is essential to creating a safer world, one where smaller nations aren't threatened by larger ones and whose sovereignty is respected, a more equal world for the betterment of everyone.